And now we're going to have our second keynote, Lisa Rennels, who ironically has been stuck with some very extreme weather and had to come remote. So she is currently awake at about 1:30 in the morning her time. So we have to first of all give us a huge cheer from here so she can hopefully hear us and wake up for this. And Lisa is currently finishing her PhD in Berkeley and working on open source infrastructure for high performance climate change research and modeling. She works in the intersection between computer science and environmental economics. So Lisa, if you are online and awake, please do take it away from us.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you guys hear me all right?
Oh, go right ahead, Lisa.
Are you able to hear me?
We are. Go right ahead. And
Oh,
you just
great.
got a huge round of applause from the room.
Oh, that's very sweet. I'm really sorry I'm not able right now to get this presentation to show up perfectly full screen. Hopefully, is this all right for now?
Yeah, we can see it just fine.
Okay, I apologize. This totally worked in the testing yesterday, but c'est la vie, you know? So we'll do our best. All right. Great. So I'm just going to make sure this switches. Okay, let's do it. So I am going to start, with an intro. So yes, my name is Lisa Rennels. I am a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. And I will be completing my PhD this year in May. I am an interdisciplinary scholar, so I work both in the Energy and Resources group, which is my home department. And this is an interdisciplinary group focusing on everything from energy efficiency to water issues to climate change economics, which is what I focus on there. And then I'm also part of the Platt Lab at Berkeley, which is in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science department. And there I focus mostly on programming languages, domain-specific languages, and usability of domain-specific languages. And I should say, feel free to just interrupt me. I'm managing a couple screens, so don't be shy. So today I'm going to present on building open source software for climate change research, lessons learned from Mimi, which is a domain-specific language that I'm a key contributor to. And so this is sort of a modified version of a talk I gave at UPSLA this year, presenting a paper entitled How Domain Experts Use an Embedded DSL. So feel free to take a look at that paper if you're interested. I'm going to sort of present an augmented version that presents this paper, but with more detailed context than I had time or interest to do at that conference. And I'm a fellow at the EPA right now, so I just have to quickly say, the views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views or policies of the US EPA. If that gives you a hint as to what it's like to build programming languages for this domain. So today I'm going to talk a bit first about introduction, context, and motivation. So I'm going to go into some different areas of context for this talk, including integrated assessment models and their policy context, embedded domain-specific languages. This might be a bit of review for this audience, but worth just setting it up. And then the specific domain-specific language I'm going to be talking about. From there, I'm going to focus on this particular research project that I did and published this year in UPSLA, going through research questions and methods, then findings and design implications, and finally my conclusions. So it's a bit of a Frankenstein talk between context and this one study. And hopefully it's interesting, and then I'm happy to talk more, answer questions, etc. Okay, so let's start with integrated assessment models and their policy context. So this is a type of model that I'm going to talk about throughout this talk, so it's worth kind of setting this up. So what are integrated assessment models, or IAMs? Very broadly, these are a type of scientific model that links main features of society and the economy with the biosphere and atmosphere into one modeling framework with a goal of accommodating informed policy making. So that was a quote by the IPCC. These are commonly used in climate change economics and also energy systems planning and all sorts of planning and modeling decisions that need to be made integrating several different domains into one. And one of the most interesting and fun parts of these models to me is that they tend to include interdisciplinary, really multi-team large efforts, which can be unique to the kind of academic realm that I'm a part of. So just as an illustrative example, the paper that I published using this model in Nature recently, this is the full team. So not only are there some 20-something people on the paper, which is not common in economics, but also they came from Resources for the Future and Rochester Institute. So Resources for the Future and EPRI are both nonprofit research organizations. Then several universities were involved, including NYU, UC Davis, University of Washington, RIT, Harvard, and Berkeley. And then several analysts actually who work at the US Environmental Protection Agency were directly involved in this project as well. So the second question is, how are these models used? These models can be used in quite a few different ways, depending on which of the kind of classes of integrated assessment models you're talking about. The ones we're going to talk about in this particular paper can serve several roles. They produce a number called the social cost of greenhouse gases. This is supposed to be the monetized impact of emitting 1 additional ton of a greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. Often carbon dioxide, but more recently methane and other greenhouse gases. These social costs are key to cost benefit analysis in the United States. So the federal government is required to perform a cost benefit analysis for any regulation over a certain threshold. And when we do that, we want now to put climate change into the cost benefit analysis, which means that if a regulation reduces greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to get something in the benefits column, because that's the avoided damages from climate change. They can also be used to calculate carbon taxes and optimal carbon taxes. More recently, a lot of experimentation around things like structural uncertainty, deeper uncertainties like the last speaker was talking about, sensitivity analyses, looking into climate tipping points and their potential effect on economics, etc. And these are widely used in the federal government. So I recently published a paper with the aforementioned team in Nature, producing new social costs of greenhouse gases that are used by current regulation within the federal government. So these models, take home message, these models really matter right now. But I always need to say that there are limitations. So these models, I think the quote is, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Definitely true here. So these models should be used in certain ways and should not be used in other ways. And different experts will kind of equivocate on the line there, but I think it's just an important thing to say about any type of large model that's trying to model something like climate change and how it impacts the economy. So a brief overview for what these look like that will just be helpful when talking about the embedded DSL later. Very generally, these can be split up into modules. So we start with the socioeconomic module. So this has exogenous emissions, income, and population projections. This feeds into a climate module, which will produce from those emissions, income, and population, temperature, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. So this is basically a reduced form version of larger general circulation models that I think some people will talk about later today. These two then feed into a damages module. So this is where we're converting things in terms of monetized damages. So for example, this might be human mortality, agriculture sector, sea level rise, wildfire, different sort of damage channels that you can think of. And this set tends to be incomplete because we can only sort of include what we have enough data and evidence to reasonably measure. And then finally, a discounting module. This is kind of econ jargon that I'm happy to talk about later, but it essentially accounts for the fact that climate change is a long-standing problem. Carbon dioxide stays in the air and has a temperature effect for hundreds of years. And so we have to use some discounting to understand how to treat damages in 500 years versus damages right now. I wanted to highlight this because I think some folks might be talking about climate emulators later today. So I just thought it might be interesting to point out a particular part of these models. So the climate module itself is a fast, simplified model that emulates general circulation models. The speed allows for interesting statistical analysis. So the general circulation models can take months to run. but are far more detailed and more useful for other cases. And there's been significant effort in the second generation of these climate modules to properly emulate temperature impulse responses. So what I mean by that is one of the most important things to integrated assessment models is that we get right the response of the climate system to an impulse of a greenhouse gas. So you see here in red, orange, and green an older generation of climate modules. And then in blue, you see the latest generation. And you see that they're doing a much better job predicting and emulating the rapid response to carbon dioxide pulses, and then also the sustained response. So this is a really important part of these modules, and it's really important that they get it right. So this is a place where there's a lot of interaction between these reduced form models and the process-based bottom-up very large models that we might hear more about today. Great. So I'm going to go into embedded domain-specific languages here a little bit. And again, sorry if it's repetition for some folks, but good context, I think. So experts across a range of diverse fields have come to rely on programming and computation, including earth sciences and climate change. So there have been quite a few examples of this recently at universities around the US and beyond. So at Berkeley, there's a big project I'm part of called Jupiter Meets the Earth, headed by Fernando Perez, that's looking at how we can better use Jupiter infrastructure to support climate and geosciences research. MIT just started this big Computing Our Climate Future cluster to put global climate modeling at the fingertips of decision makers. So they're much more focused on the climate modeling side of things. I was at JuliaCon recently, and there were a bunch of really amazing talks from folks at MIT and Caltech who are part of this effort. And then, at JuliaCon recently, there was a session called The Anatomy of Earth System Software in Julia. And there were several really fantastic talks about different domain-specific languages and implementations of the Julia language, which is what I work in, for geosciences. So this is really a budding field. But one kind of challenge is that practitioners in this field tend to lack formal computer science training, but share problem formulations and vocabulary. So this is sort of a specific setup that we've often seen when we think about using domain-specific languages. So they are a long-standing and popular strategy for meeting the needs of these domain experts, including the subset embedded domain-specific languages, which I'm going to be talking about here, and we can think about as packages or just smaller languages that sort of live inside a host language or a general purpose language. Brief pause for terminology here. So in this, I'm going to use the term developer or designer to talk about individuals who are designing and implementing languages, DSLs and eDSLs, and a user or an end user to talk about individuals writing programs with those languages. So since this is sort of going to be a user study, it's important to just specify that. And then there's user experience versus usability. So I'm going to say user experience is sort of a very broad term to discuss all the aspects of a programmer's interaction with the language, programming tools, language communities, etc. And then usability to refer to more specifically discussions of whether users can easily accomplish a particular goal with a given tool. So that's the context for eDSLs. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit before I dive into the study. I'm going to talk about Mimi, which is the embedded DSL that I'm going to focus on in this project. So Mimi is an eDSL for integrated assessment models, so bringing together the last two sections that I talked about. Before Mimi, there were a fragmented multitude of hosting platforms and programming languages and APIs that integrated assessment model authors used. So different IAMs were built on different structures. They were built in different languages, which made it quite difficult for researchers to kind of get their hands dirty with one of them, let alone several of them, which is a big problem now, especially because there's a lot of focus on not only just running and examining one model, but comparing them, doing intermodel comparisons, uncertainty analysis, sensitivity analysis, and other things like that. So this setup forced researchers to sort of live in their silos, write their own code, and carry out things like uncertainty and sensitivity analysis from scratch, which seemed to lead to a very cursory take or an omission of that kind of comparison. So a large report by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in 2017, this group was tasked with sort of discussing the next generation of social cost of carbon estimates and the integrated assessment models and different ways to improve things and research directions. And one of the things that was really pushed was an open source, computationally efficient, publicly accessible, and clearly documented computational platform to remedy some of the problems above. And that's what we decided to build. My advisor claims he came up with the idea before that mandate, but we will never know. So Mimi is an eDSL for this purpose. On the left, you can see a sort of schematic of what an integrated assessment model might look like. So you have these modules connected together that produce output results. Could be the social cost of carbon, could be a carbon tax schedule, could be a welfare metric, but this is generally what they're represented as schematically. And on the right, you can see in code what our embedded DSL would do to write up the part in red. And I'm just going to point out, point out this sort of red box. And I'm just going to point out a couple kind of key features of this embedded domain specific language. Oh, never mind. I'm going to do that next. First, I'm going to point out just that this language is used quite a bit. So we've seen quite a bit of adoption by several different communities, which has been really exciting. Definitely a challenge with kind of typical open source software type challenges, maintaining forums and such. But on the left, we can see that there are several public models using this language now. We brought several existing integrated assessment models onto the platform ourselves. We also worked with researchers who helped us do so. And now there are quite a few people actively developing integrated assessment models right on this software platform. And people publishing quite a few papers building off of models on the platform. So in the center, I'm just showing a subset of the universities who have been intimately involved with this. So we've got Princeton, Berkeley, Davis, RIT, but also folks at the London School of Economics, a couple schools in Germany, et cetera. So that's been really successful. We're also seeing it underpin novel academic research, which is really exciting because one of the main goals was not only just to create more models, but to help researchers answer questions that they might previously have had, but been unable to answer. So recently, a couple different publications, including ones underpinning Environmental Protection Agency decisions, have been underpinned by this framework. And finally, on the right, there have been recent supplemental rules to reduce methane and other harmful pollutants from the oil and gas industry published by the EPA, as well as rules on the phase down of hydrofluorocarbons. These are a really potent greenhouse gas that replaced ozone depleting substances. So an unfortunate part of environment is sometimes we fix one problem and create a new problem. So hydrofluorocarbons are a greenhouse gas that were used to replace CFCs that were ozone depleting. So the point here is just that at this point, we have government agencies who are publishing open source code to underpin their rulemaking that is built on this platform. So that's just been really exciting and shows that this is seeing uptake. So something is going right. But it's also served as sort of a sandbox to explore this kind of work, and that's what I'll talk about in the next section. So back to Mimi, I'm just going to point out a couple sort of nerdy points about how we decided to build this language, and then I'll go into the study. So first, we use this sort of Lego-like or modular approach. So this is sort of, the idea is that this is how people think about these models. We're trying to kind of mental map to how folks think about and build integrated assessment models. So we use macros like add comp to add a component, update param to update a given parameter in a given component, and connect param, which helps connect parameters between components. So the main point here is simply that we're trying to use this Lego approach to mimic the mental model of how climate scientists and climate economists think about these models. We also lean very heavily on Julia's package management. So dealing with replicability and version control is really important, especially for these for the code that is underpinning rules, and for replicability, which is really important even legally. So we really lean very heavily on the Julia package management system. We use a lot of custom types and multiple dispatch. This is partially to leverage the strengths of Julia, but did allow us to write a very kind of clean language with a very small API. But these choices had some mixed results, which I will talk about in a little bit. And macros, as I mentioned, we lean pretty heavily on macros to define the major parts of the models, including the components, the model itself, a Monte Carlo simulation, and others. And this is another place that we saw kind of both success and frustration. And a lot of the frustration is probably common to programming designers and language designers who have mixed and very strong opinions, including myself, on the use of macros. So those were just some interesting parts of the language design. So this motivation is going to dive into the second part of this talk, which is about the actual user study that was performed. So evidence suggests an opportunity for language designers to improve the user experience via a better understanding of user needs. So this is sort of a simplified version of a table in a 2008 paper that I found really motivating and helpful for this study that showed basically a ranking of domain-specific language implementation approaches. And what it shows is that it ranks implementation effort, so effort by the designer, and then it also ranks the value on the end user effort. And a real dichotomy shows up here with embedded as an approach, because we see that designers really like embedded languages. The implementation effort tends to be low. You can lean quite heavily on the general purpose language or host language, a lot of the infrastructure, and just sort of add a layer on top for your embedded language. But the study also found that on end user effort, there was a lot of difficulty. So I won't go into all the findings of this paper. Recommend you read it if you're interested, but I'll just kind of use this as motivation. We felt like there were a lot of pain points in places that we could more specifically dig into the user needs and the user experience with this language. Just checking. All right. So to dive into the study a little bit, the two research questions we started with were, number one, what kinds of programming challenges do domain experts face during use of an eDSL designed for their domain, in this case, climate change economics and climate change policy? And which of these challenges arrive specifically because the DSL is embedded or because of interactions between the DSL and the host language? So this study was focused on embedding, but we did try to come up with generalizable insults to all domain-specific languages for climate policy, climate economics, and more broadly, just the climate and geosciences fields. So this was a user study with domain experts. So one of the most important things here is that we were really focusing on domain experts, not computer science experts. So we worked with economists from the federal government, assistant professors at various universities, postdocs, and others. So main categories were people at NGOs, within academia, and in the federal government. These are people that were already using this language, but are generally not formally trained in computer science. They might have experience with data science, experience with wrangling and programming, but no formal training. And I'll just mention the methods briefly here. I can go into them later if folks have questions, but for the sake of time, I don't have a lot of details. But this was a contextual inquiry study. So the general idea was that we went where people were, remotely, I guess, so I didn't go there. I watched them on Zoom. But we asked people essentially to join a Zoom session. We would record it, and we would just ask them to use the embedded domain-specific language in whatever way they always used it. So we didn't give them a task. We didn't ask them to do anything specific. We just asked them to use it in the way that they were already using it for a project, and we observed. And we only interrupted to ask questions if we were really confused about what was going on or we wanted some detail on what the person was trying to do. And in this way, we ended up with several hours of video recordings of real users using this tool. And then we went back and watched these videos, coded up small segments, and then from these codes built up some theories and themes about what we were seeing. So that was the general sort of approach of this usability analysis that brings together human-computer interaction and usability analysis with programming language design. And I really encourage anyone who's interested in that intersection to take a look at the Plate Lab and the work of Sarah Chasins at UC Berkeley, because there's some really great stuff going on there in a couple different domains. So I'm going to talk very briefly about findings and design implications from this work. So there were 5 key categories of findings, and I'm only going to focus on a few of them, but I list them all here. Impacts of the host language, impacts of the interaction between the host and the embedded language, engaging with eDSL specific communities, engaging with eDSL specific tutorials and code bases, and integrating multiple tools via the host language. So I'll just zoom in on a few of these for interest. So the first one, impact of the host language and interaction between host and embedded language. So the general idea here is that we found that blurring the line between the embedded DSL and the host language made some tasks, especially debugging tasks, ambiguous for participants. And this was somewhat surprising because a lot of design guidelines in the embedded language field encourage a seamless integration of the embedded DSL into the host language. And sometimes that works, but we also observed that when participants couldn't find those seams between the embedded language and the host language, they really struggled. They expressed confusion about the distinction between Mimi and Julia and sought clarity on the dividing lines. And this was interesting for us and cast some doubt on the design tenet that embedded DSLs should be seamless extensions of a language, especially perhaps in a case where the user isn't super experienced with either the host language or the embedded language yet, or if they're just more novice programmers. So the blurred general purpose language, embedded language distinction especially seemed to hamper debugging efforts. And so I'm going to show 2 cases of this. In the first case, participants tended to mistake Julia behaviors or Julia behaviors for Mimi behaviors, and this was really confusing. So in this particular case, when one participant encountered a Julia error, they tried to use the help functionality in Julia to search for help. So parameter here is not a Julia type or a Julia function. It's a custom type within Mimi. And since the help functionality in Mimi is not perfectly integrated with the help functionality in Julia, looking for this parameter custom type from Mimi was unsuccessful for the user. So they didn't understand that parameter was a custom type in Mimi, and they thought it was a Julia custom type or a Julia type. And it took them a while to kind of figure out where to find information. So in this case, the blurring of the line between the two made it hard for the participant to look for help. Now, this might imply that you need to integrate your embedded language even deeper into the general purpose language documentation, which is one of the findings I'll discuss later. In a second case, instead of the blurring of the line being perfect, it was almost perfect, which ended up creating a problem. So what you see here is on the top line, temperature equals parameter, and then there's some arguments. So this is a Mimi snippet. It's with a macro, and it was written to look a lot like a Julia function. So this syntax looks quite a bit like a Julia function, but it's not a Julia function. It's within a macro and is going to be parsed. Using a parsing logic in the macro implementation, not using Julia directly. And a little thing happened here. Basically, this code looked so much like a Julia function that an automatic formatter came in and put a semicolon before the named arguments. And this is a very common thing in Julia. If you have named arguments, you can put a semicolon between the unnamed and named arguments. And that's sort of like the proper way to do it. So the formatter recognized that and did that. Unfortunately, the macro was not written to be able to handle those semicolons. So this created a parsing error. And parsing errors for anybody are very confusing and hard to understand. but they are particularly difficult for people without any any computer science background. So this kind of load error with low-level syntax from parsing is extremely confusing for a user. And in this case, this sort of imperfect integration between the domain-specific language and the host language created a lot of confusion. So what are the design considerations here? Well, the general idea was that properties of the host language affect embedded DSL users, not just the developers. And in particular, we have 5 points in this section, but I'm just talking about one. Blurring the distinction between the host language and the embedded language may confuse and hinder participants. So this led to a couple different design considerations. First, designers may want to anticipate confusion for novice users and also some natural curiosity, which we noticed about the distinction between the host and the embedded language. Second, it might be helpful to pair documentation. So to kind of fix the first problem, it might be helpful to not only blur the line between the languages, but try to blur the documentation and the help language. This was actually a suggestion by a user, was also as they were trying to learn Julia at the same time as the embedded language, they suggested that there should be pointers within the DSL documentation to the necessary Julia understanding. So that was a really useful suggestion that we're going to implement. And then also more broadly, that there might be cases where explicit differentiation between the embedded language and the host language might be particularly helpful. Which goes a bit against the design tenet, but we do think in some cases this might be helpful. A second key finding is a bit less technical, but had to do with engaging with eDSL specific communities. So participants tended to prefer forums and communities that catered specifically to the eDSL rather than to the host language. So we took a look through Stack Overflow and the Julia language discourse and found very few questions about the eDSL or Mimi at all. But we also run a Mimi forum. So the team monitors live different questions and gives help. And we notice that that's quite active. So people are seeking help online, but they tend to look for this embedded domain-specific language or perhaps just domain-specific area to ask their questions. And it was a very common sort of verbal support for reporting that these eDSL specific communities and also just seeing a thriving community using the domain specific language played a really big role in the adoption decisions. So one person said, I guess that also seeing other papers using it and having the thought that at some point I could implement it or merge my components with others was tempting. Okay, so this is a way to get close to research groups that are using it. So we really did find, and that this can be specific to certain domains, certainly in the climate change world and the modeling world, that a lot of the work being done is incremental. So people want to connect with other people using the same tools and publish with them and build incrementally off of their work. So we therefore found that engaging with an eDSL specific community was really important. So a few design considerations here are kind of twofold. One is that running our own forum and answering questions is really helpful. This might seem obvious, but I think that one of the things we were thinking is that one of the reasons to use a general purpose language is that you might be able to piggyback on things like documentation, forums, question answering, etc. And while to a certain extent that's true, we found that we actually needed to take responsibility for running a forum, answering questions of our users. Otherwise, we likely weren't going to get adoption. And I think a lot of this, when we talked to folks individually, has to do with the fact that if you're not a computer science person or a programmer, some of those forums can be really intimidating. They can take a long time for people to respond. People can be a little snarky, and they just really appreciated talking to folks in their own domain. So this was really important. And second of all, we, for example, held a pre-conference workshop at a really large climate change and policy conference in 2019 for, I think, about 60 or 70 users to learn how to use this language and work together. And a lot of the users that we interviewed came from this conference, and that's how they were first introduced to it. So kind of encouraging places where people can learn and work together and build a community seems to be really important for the success and adoption of these languages. Okay, and one of the final design considerations that we noted, which is quite similar to what I just talked about, is that folks really did engage with eDSL specific tutorials and code bases. So rather than starting new programs from scratch, participants tended to start from an existing embedded domain specific language program and then tweak it to meet their needs. So as a visual, in gray here is sort of a typical integrated assessment model that was published in a paper. It's called the DICE model, and it's quite common and used quite a bit. And in a recent paper by two friends of mine, Bernie Dustin and Fran Moore, who are some great climate policy researchers, they took an existing model in gray and then they added the parts in blue. And in this case, they were adding natural capital, non-use value, biodiversity value, and trying to think about the value of nature within one of these models. They added it and then they published a paper. So this is a very common type of paper in this field where you tweak an existing program. I'm just hearing dots. I assume someone will tell me if there's anything I need to. Great.
So we're just into Q&A time now, just so you have a time.
Okay. Great. I am almost done. Sorry, I guess my timer was off. So basically participants sought eDSL specific documentation and tutorials, and they used the presented sample programs as templates. So I'm going to skip this example if I'm into time. My bad, I must have had my timer off. So this is final design considerations. Users may rely on existing code and avoid starting from scratch. And we can support this with various eDSL features. And also this may freeze and propagate program structures and practices. So final notes, a couple abstractions can support users in building upon each other's work. So we had a couple abstractions that really focused on taking existing models and modifying them. And we also speculate that in this particular domain, it's important to think about this. And one of the reasons is that these models are often subject to quite a bit of scrutiny within the legal world, in the policy world, and it's just important for users to know that what they're building on is sound. So it's often the case that people want to build on something that's been published, peer-reviewed, and worked on, as opposed to starting from scratch. So in conclusion, there were 5 main findings from this study. It's published in a paper called How Domain Experts Use an Embedded DSL, which I'm happy to talk more about. And just very much more broadly, there's a lot of space for help with domain-specific language work and programming within the climate policy world, which is something that I'm quite intimately connected with and happy to think about and talk to folks about. And that's it.
Thank you very much.
Sorry
Lisa.
to go over.
So a fascinating connection as well between the need for DSLs, the questions about whether or not they should be embedded or not, and how we can make these applicable to vernacular programmers who aren't experts in the particular domain. So we'll take a combination of Drew's ideas from the first talk and yours, Lisa's, as well, when you're hopefully fast asleep in the afternoon sessions and try to figure out if we can come up with some ideas from a programming language perspective. Now, we have time for just 1 or 2 questions, and then Lisa will actually be hanging around as well during the break online as a disembodied voice in order to have, so if anyone does want to have a quick further conversation with her before it gets really too late there, she's very happy to hang around. So do we have any questions for Lisa right now from the general audience? We have one there.
Hello, great talk. I was curious about the actual language. It seems like it's declarative and maybe somewhat like a graphical model language like Stan. Is that correct in my understanding?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that the way we designed this one, it's not as much of a graphical model language, although I think that was something that we considered. So in this case, we're more of like a macro-based domain-specific language without some of the categories or some of the features of a graphical language. But I did read quite a few papers about graphical languages while working on this study, and I think that might have been a good approach to this. And more broadly, as we kind of, I think, realized from the previous talk and this one, there are a lot of space for graphical type languages because quite a few of these things are very process based, feeding results between each other, even GIS models. So I think there's a lot of space there.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I wonder if you could say a bit about how it was actually designed. Like, was there a kind of co-design process with domain experts? Like, how did you kind of settle on the abstractions and the key abstractions for the language?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was not there at the inception. I came in maybe a year and a half into the process. And so I would say that in this case, the people who designed the language itself were also domain experts. So David Antoff and Cora Kingdon and I kind of are the main designers, and we all actually fit between these communities. So David, my advisor, is he's basically spent most of his career both doing software engineering and climate change economics and integrated assessment modeling. So we are quite intimately aware of how these models are built. However, I think that like next time around, it would be really good to do some sort of co-design. And one of the main reasons I wanted to do this study was because we felt like we were making a lot of assumptions about what people want and the types of features they want to focus on. And I think some of our findings were that the types of features that we get excited about and want to focus on are sometimes more kind of detailed and fancy and fast and performance based than what our average user actually would like us to focus on. So I think doing some sort of iterative process next time would be a really good idea. And I'm in some discussions, including one of the hosts who's not there, but Professor Koblenz, on doing that kind of thing.
Again, Professor Koblenz, I think, was on is one of our PC members on PROPL as well.
Yes, yes, he is. He's at UCSD and interested in this for some climate data processing stuff. So I'm excited about that.
So I think that concludes our questions for now. Let's thank Lisa again for a
Great.
wonderful keynote. Thank you so much.